So I'd like to get a little bit more general now. I want to hear about influenza. So you, of course, did an insane amount of research for your book about influenza. I'm curious, what is still relevant for today's pandemic that you learned 100 years after the influenza pandemic?
Well, as you said, I wrote this book on influenza that came out 2 years ago now. It seems like forever. 2 years ago in 2018, which is the 100th anniversary of the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And I looked at what had happened over the last 100 years. I did tell the story of what happened in 1918, which is very sobering, of course. 50 to 100 million people died in the world, across the world. 675,000 people in the United States died, which is the equivalent in today's population of about 3 million. So it was far more deadly, at least in terms of numbers, than the COVID pandemic is so far. And let's hope that the COVID pandemic does not catch up to that awful number of deaths in the US and across the world. But influenza does remain, of course, a perennial challenge for us. And we are still trying to find that vaccine that can be given once and once only, that will cover all different types of influenza virus, all the different viruses that are across the world. They differ from each other. So you can get a vaccine that's given once. It'll be good against all the different kinds of the virus. And it will last for many, many years. Just giving a vaccine, each year is a problem, because people have to remember and they have to come back and so on. If we can have a vaccine that will give us the kind of long-term protection that, for instance, the MMR, mumps, measles, rubella vaccine gives us, that would be an incredible breakthrough as well. And we don't have that yet with the influenza vaccine. Influenza each year in the United States kills anywhere between 12,000 and over 100,000 people each year. We don't have good statistics about it, simply because it's very difficult for everybody to agree on whether a death is caused by influenza or secondary pneumonia from influenza or heart failure caused by influenza. Certainly in older people and younger people, it's often, unfortunately, easier to decide that this was a death directly from influenza. So we have a very wide range of estimation of the number of people who died. And certainly at the very beginning of the outbreak of COVID, people were warning, and I think I was one of them as well, who said, look, so far, and this was sort of in January time, the enemy is influenza rather than COVID. Now, of course, we know that changed very quickly, but influenza certainly remains a challenge for all of us. And what I'm hopeful for is that, because of the precautions that all of us are or should be taking with masks and hand washing and social distancing, that the influenza numbers actually will be way, way lower than they are in a normal year. We would expect that, because influenza is passed in much the same way as COVID is passed, on droplets. And if you're not in the office or on a bus or on the subway being sneezed on by other people who have it, then you're less likely to get it. So one would expect that when the dust settles and we're able to look back at the at the flu season last year and this year, that we will actually see a decrease in the number of deaths from influenza. And that, of course, will again remind us that every year we need to be taking these precautions. COVID will go away eventually, either through a vaccine or just through the natural process. All pandemics come to an end. The question is how much damage they can cause while they're active. But when COVID has gone away, I think that we will be able to learn and remind ourselves that just taking these very basic precautions is not only good for reducing your risk of COVID, but it's also a very good way to stay healthy over the winter from all flu and other winter viruses. There's a couple of wonderful studies that were done in which kindergarten children were put into different groups. One class would wash their hands several times a day, and the other class would not be told to wash their hands several times a day, just as needed. And when you compared the two different groups, of course, the kindergartners who washed their hands several times a day had a much lower absentee rate, because of virus infections and so on. And that's just a sort of a little morsel that reminds us that these very basic precautions that we're all now taking are good, not only for COVID, but for all of the winter viruses.
Absolutely. I also hope that people will be more likely to take the flu vaccine this year. We don't have a coronavirus vaccine yet, but what we do have will also, help you stay healthy. So make
That's
sure you're
right.
getting those flu shots.
Especially in those members of the population and your listeners who are especially vulnerable. That's the elderly, that's people with underlying medical conditions. Women who are pregnant are also at increased risk of complications of flu. And so it's especially important in those vulnerable populations. But of course, the rest of us also should really get vaccinated.